In the last few lectures, I was fundamentally talking about how you reach more and more people. I didn't really talk much about positioning. The reason, and this is controversial for me to say, is that positioning isn't really as important as you may think it is, particularly at the highest levels of product marketing. And why is that? Well, one of the reasons I say it is because when we look at the research, and in particular business to business, but also in business to consumer, the big problem isn't so much what people think of your product, it's that they haven't even thought of your product at all. So how you're positioned often is not the biggest issue you need to address. It's just, have people even heard of you? Are they even considering you regardless of what your positioning is? Now, a lot of this really depends on your definition of positioning. And there really is no consensus on what that is. And some people have this conflation between positioning and marketing strategy, but I treat them as two separate things. So if you define positioning as having to do something with selecting your target market, then yes, that's a strategic decision, and that should come before you do something like an awareness campaign, because you need to know who the target customer group is, for example, before you go and start marketing to them. However, the way I define positioning is making the choice of what to emphasize in your marketing communications. And what you emphasize is going to vary based on case. Are you talking about the brand, which is going to be positioned around something for the long term and something for mass appeal? Are you positioning the product, which tends to take a more rational positioning because it's more around short-term consideration factors? Are we talking about an advertisement positioning where we may be focused on just a single use case, or perhaps a single benefit or a single feature? Or are we talking about a campaign which may be focused on a series of different features or use cases? So positioning is going to vary. Now, based on my definition, which is positioning is choosing what to emphasize in your marketing communications, why might it be less important? So the reason is that as you get bigger and bigger, and as your ambitions get bigger and you want to become one of the biggest players on the market, essentially your end game in marketing is a oligopolistic competition. So you want to be one of the handful of big players that are competing against each other at scale. Now, what's the problem with emphasizing positioning? Well, one of the rabbit holes you end up in is if your positioning's too good, or your positioning matters a lot, you kind of end up in a niche market. If you have a unique angle and you're really highlighting just one or two different things, you're probably not appealing to a large enough market. Now, there's going to be exceptions to that, but I'm just talking in generalities. So sometimes what happens is if you get big enough, really you just have to take broad positioning because that's necessary to appeal to a large market, and that's what your competitors are doing. And you might think, oh, well, we need to be different. Well, points of difference cease to matter as much when really the competitive advantage is economies of scale. So that's what happens as you get bigger. It becomes battles of economies of scale and battles of awareness, product awareness, brand awareness, etc. Less about how do we take niche positionings. Now, if you're a small niche player, that's fine. You can have a unique position and you can have a sustainable business built around that, but that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about going big. Now, I want to compare this to some research from Jeffrey Pfeffer. So Jeffrey Pfeffer is not a marketer. He talks about things like leadership and how people get to high, powerful positions in industry. And one of the reasons they get promoted or they get to these high positions in the corporate world is simple. They get noticed because people that get noticed are considered. And that's perhaps the biggest barrier to your success in product marketing, is that people just never heard of you. And if they've never heard of you, they're never going to consider you. And it just simply doesn't matter how you position yourself if that message doesn't get to anybody. So the analogy I like to use is laws that don't get enforced. So there's legislation that gets passed, and sometimes that legislation's completely ridiculous and nobody would ever follow it. But those laws, they don't matter. The reason they don't matter is because there's no weight behind them. They're not getting enforced, and they're not getting any awareness. So that's what I want you to think about when you're going big with your product marketing is the big issue how you're positioned, or is the big issue that most of your TAM, your total addressable market, just doesn't even have you in their mind at all?